Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Ellen Weiss. I am a member of the FIJ board and really delighted for our conversation today. Inside the investigation, we're going to be talking about cold cases. We have two fantastic grantees. Um, but before we get into today's topic, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about FIJ grants and how you also can be awarded up to $10,000 to support your investigation. And if anyone watching or listening has applied for an FIJ grant, what type did you get? Could you just talk about it or put something in the chat so that we, kind of have a sense of who maybe had what your experience has been? Um, I want to talk about applying for the grants, what makes a good grant. FIJ exists to support independent journalists, news organizations, to produce high quality, unbiased, nonpartisan investigative stories that have an impact. And I don't need to tell anybody watching right now, at a time when so many are cutting back on support for investigative work, how important what FIJ is doing. I mean, we want to give you money to do your work. That's the best way I can put it. So I want to just I'm going to share my screen for a second and go through a few points. And again, if you have any questions, we're definitely going to get to them at the end, but please feel free to put them in the chat or to put them into Q&A. So let me share my screen for a sec. And yeah, so first of all, what kind of funding does FIJ provide? Well, we provide a couple of different kinds of grants, right? There's regular grants, which are up to $10,000, and that's to cover investigative stories on any topic, on any platform. It has to have a US outlet, right? There are also seed grants, and this is something that we started just a couple of years ago. And I think for any of us who have done investigative reporting, we all know that there's a lot of reporting you have to do before you know you have a story, right? And so this is that seed money to help you figure out and shape your investigative story. And those are up to $2,500. And if you get a seed grant, a lot of our seed grant recipients then apply for the full grant. So it doesn't prohibit you from applying for another grant, right? And then we have follow-up grants also, and those are for journalists that have received a regular grant, and now maybe there's a follow-up, right? That's what we hope. We hope that your reporting leads to more reporting, and so there are grants for that as well. Yeah. So what are we looking for in an application, right? Well, first of all, we want to know what makes this an investigative story, right? Because that is ultimately, what we support. What's the main question you're trying to answer? What are you going to uncover that's new? What's your roadmap for tracking down information, right? So hopefully you already have some initial findings, right? Maybe you've gotten some data. Maybe you already have interviewed sources, right? We want you to be specific and tell us what you've already learned that this will make a good story. Everything you tell us is confidential. We are all investigative reporters involved in the evaluation, so we know how to hold this information. It's important to understand what you're uncovering that's new. I'm sure we've all been in the butt end of a editor telling us that story's already been covered. Well, of course it's already been covered, but that doesn't mean that either the problem's solved or there isn't a new angle to it. So we understand that your story might have been covered, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a new way into it that might call more attention, right? And then, why do you think, you're the one that can do that story? It might be that you've covered it before. It might be that you have sources. It might be that your news organization is focused on this topic. So yeah, so please, again, feel free to put questions in if you have questions about regular grants, right? Who's eligible, right? Actually, pretty much all journalists are eligible. We give a lot of our grants to freelancers. And you need a letter of commitment from an outlet, and we can talk a little bit about, what that means. But we also give funding to journalists on staff at nonprofits and also traditional media outlets. We need an individual to apply, but it can be for a group of people as well. Any limitations on formats? Not really. We provide grants for print, digital, audio, video, photojournalism, even books. Again, as long as they're investigative. Um, we get a lot of questions about international stories. And yes, some of the international stories are eligible. Um, there's a couple of caveats. They either need to come from a US-based reporter or have a strong US angle, right? Meaning like it affects US citizens, it involves a US business or government. It also needs an outlet in English that's US based. Um, so those are, some of the caveats on international stories. Um, Again, if you have any questions, we ask you to put together a budget. And there's certain expenses FIJ will cover and certain that we probably won't, right? So hard costs, travel, data collection, small stipends. I put a little example of what a budget would look like. So you can see it's a lot of travel, there's public records, and yes, there's a stipend that the reporter has paid themselves as well. The kinds of things that we won't cover, renting office space, buying equipment, but we will pay for things like renting equipment because we know sometimes, you need special equipment, especially if you're doing audio or video. Um, okay. So then seed grants. Seed grants, basically, as I said, it's this sort of starter grant to help you get to that, nail down your idea for your larger investigation, $2,500. It pretty much like a regular grant, what you're looking for is an investigative story. Same thing that journalists are either US based or it has a strong US angle. Again, these are smaller grants, but the idea is that it will cover things like that initial open records request, or maybe you need to take one trip to be able to talk to that source, in person, right? What you don't need for a seed grant, what we won't ask you for in the application is a letter of commitment or initial findings, because we know that in order to get that letter of commitment, you kind of need to do this degree of reporting. Um, yeah. Just to let you know, it may seem far away, but the next deadlines are in September. Regular grants September 8th, seed grants September 15th. There's a lot of information on the website. You can ask us questions. And again, I know those dates seem far off, but I also know that the better your application is, the more sure you are of you have your sources, you have your initial findings, you really kind of know what the story is, you know what your reporting plan is, the more likely it is that that we're gonna approve your grant. I'm gonna stop sharing for a sec and just kind of look at some questions. Are there previous grantees on the FIJ website? There absolutely are. You can go on the site and you'll see, most of the stories that we funded, I believe are there. There's certainly a lot of them. And then in the chat, let me just go quickly. Yeah. Let's see. FIJ. Okay, great. We heard from somebody who at the nonprofit, at the Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, about a support for a seed grant that we gave them and a regular grant that we gave them. That's great. Bill Marimo, welcome. Bill's also an FIJ member. That's right. FIJ also provides mentees for grantees, right? These are journalists who have done the kinds of stories you're proposing. We try to look for a match. So if you're looking at someone criminal justice, someone like Bill, or police, someone like Bill, is there to support you, which is super helpful. Um, question about will these slides be available after the session? What we'll send you after the session is a recording, but all of this information I took from the FIJ website, so it's all there already. And yeah, so without any more delay, I'm going to get on to today's, grantees. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Um, we're going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes. Um, if you have questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A section. As I said, we are recording this webinar. We're going to post it. Our grantees have also prepared a tip sheet, and that'll be available on the website. And then anybody who registered is also going to get a recording. So without further ado, oh wait, a couple other questions. Let me just see. So it's right that the $2,500 seed grants are a little bit less hurdles to get. Yeah, I would say that's a good way to put it. I mean, again, we want to give out as many grants, as we can. We don't have a quota, but the requirements for the seed grant are less rigorous because we understand that really you have a hunch, you probably have more than a hunch, you have a little bit of information, and you just want to test out your theory. And that's sort of what the seed grant gives you an opportunity to do. So today, we are going to be discussing, how do you dig into a decades-old cold case, right? And for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, a cold case is a crime or a suspected crime that's never been solved. But the investigation into it, has for the most part gone cold. The investigators think that, they followed all the leads, they pursued every angle, but they've turned up nothing conclusive, nothing that could lead to building a criminal case. There are currently hundreds of thousands of cold cases in the US, cases where the system has moved on, even while the families, the loved ones, the communities, have not. I would say, to take on any one of these cold cases as an investigative reporting project is kind of a leap of faith, right? It's a belief that you are going to do what local, state, and as you'll hear, even federal authorities fail to do. It takes a lot of persistence, it takes a lot of patience, and some amazing digging. And today we're featuring two projects and two reporters that exemplify all of that. What's interesting is these stories have so much in common, right? They're both decades old. These are both cases where a Black person was killed by a white person, yet at the time, race was quickly dismissed as a motive. Both are unsolved murders where the initial investigations were shallow, witnesses were ignored, motives, evidence, they were all very quickly declared closed. And both, as you'll also hear, again, didn't close for the families or the communities, and they reveal such deep flaws in the justice system. These cases remained dormant for years until these reporters recognized that there was a lot more to uncover. And both these reporters spent years digging into cases and piecing together what happened. So I'm going to introduce our guests one at a time. In 1968, a young Black woman named Carol Jenkins was brutally murdered on the streets of Martinsville, Indiana. Jenkins at the time was 21 when she was murdered while selling encyclopedias door to door. And Carol's case went unsolved for 33 years until a series of reports by investigative reporter Sandra Chapman prompted a woman to come forward with a stunning secret. Carol's death prompted generations of fear and mournings for African Americans throughout central Indiana and among students passing through Martinsville en route to Indiana University in Bloomington. Martinsville became known nationally as a racist community that refused to believe Carol's death was the result of a hate crime. Sandra brings viewers through her documentary beyond the headlines and into the drama of one of Indiana's most notorious civil rights era murders in her documentary, The Girl in the Yellow Scarf, which just won a Telly Award, congratulations, and several film festival awards for Best Documentary and an Audience Choice Award. Sandra is a former award-winning reporter with WTHR-TV and Wish TV, both in Indianapolis. Last year, she was inducted into the Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame after a very successful broadcast career. She's the recipient of the Jod Forster Peabody Award, 2 National Gracies, a National NABJ Salute to Excellence Award, a Regional Murrow, and dozens of regional Emmys, among others. So, Sandra, amazing work. I remember when you and I first talked, you explained to me this story was really an open secret, right? That you pretty much heard about on your first day on the job. And I wonder if you could tell me what you were told when you arrived at your station.
Sure, absolutely. And it's great to be here. In the 90s, when I came to Indianapolis to Wish TV, as a young journalist, I was pulled aside and told as a Black woman to never go to Martinsville, Indiana alone, that it wasn't safe for me. And, I thought, well, this is the 90s. Why? What's the problem? And they proceeded to tell me that this young Black woman had been killed there and that it was believed to be a racial murder and nothing ever came of it. And so that was planted in the back of my mind, for years before I started to dig into this story. But clearly, there was a warning, and apparently, this type of warning was coming to African Americans moving into Indiana, no matter where they were. They were hearing the same things.
Wow. And you didn't get a lot of enthusiasm when you pitched the story until you got a break. And maybe you could talk us up to, and we'll play a little bit of some of the tape of what you were able to get.
Sure. Yes, I had pitched this story after seeing Carol's stepfather, Paul Davis. Like on the anniversary, we typically talk about cases or things like that. And I kept seeing him appear asking for information. And I don't know what it was in 2001, but it just really captured my attention. And I thought that's really odd. Of course, he believed that this was a racially motivated killing. He had some information, but nothing concrete. And so I pitched the story, of course, and it was like, he's never had an investigative story. They did, short little clips and snippets, but never a full-fledged investigation as to what happened in this case. So I had proposed that, and I was given a small window to try to go and figure out what I could find. And basically, we got into the investigation and found that there were 3 main suspects and that the police had looked at, and for various reasons they had crossed them all off the list. The one that was particularly interesting was the most or the number 1 suspect, I should say. And he was crossed off the list because they said he had been killed in a police shootout in Illinois. And so, I started asking, well, where's the information for this? Do you have a report? What agency? No one could tell me anything. And so right away, I think, and then talking to the Davis family, they had had the same questions and issues and had hired a private eye. And so I was like, well, we want to jump in on this and I want to find out for myself, what happened to this person. And so that is what led to the break in the case for us to be able to actually um, broadcast the case because we found this new information.
Yeah. So you pursued this lead, you're looking for the main suspect. Everybody thought he was dead. He wasn't. Um, and I'm gonna play the tape of him because on the one hand, you'd be like, okay, at the end when you find out he's not dead, there's then this huge, like within a couple of weeks, transition in the story. So bear with me. I'm going to share my screen again. And so here's the tape. Did you know that you were supposed to be dead?
No, no, I never heard that. I've never killed nobody in my life. They've been down and questioned. I gave them DNA samples. I took a lie detector test. I think you killed her. And I said, and I think this interview's over. I I said, if that's what you're thinking, get your damn warrant, come on down here and arrest me, because by God, you're going to have a hard time convicting me of anything.
If you have information regarding this case, contact the Morgan County prosecutor. Then a phone call that changed everything.
If this girl had a yellow scarf and was killed with a screwdriver, my father could be the killer. He and another man passed a girl and stopped and killed her. I was 7 years old at the time.
That
So Sandra, on the one hand, like your best lead, the case is, he denies doing it, you found him, and it's kind of like, and then within a couple of weeks, you get this amazing phone call. Just talk us through a little bit, like what you were going through. I mean, what happened?
Well, it was pretty amazing because the video that you saw that's in the graphic there with James Harley Smith, we actually had, a camera go down and find him in Florida. So we had this incredible undercover video. And, we're like, does this man look dead to you? And of course he was alive. So that really generated a lot of interest in the story. And the fact that here, these police departments were saying their suspect was dead and we find him alive. So that in and of itself created a lot of reactions. And so we got just a trove of phone calls and everything. People thought, well, of course he's going to say he didn't do it. And so, even though he seemed like he had a lot of gravitas, like, get your warrant and come get me, um, you know, there was still some thought that perhaps he could be the one. We were getting letters from, the prosecutor, everyone. They were so angry that we had done this story because it made them not look so good, basically showing the shoddy police work that had been done. And then these other calls were coming in, and it was easy to listen. If you're an investigative reporter or a reporter, you know when tips come in about a story that you really know very well, and the the information that they're offering is so far off that it can't be true. So we got a lot of that. Just, we called them hot air tips that people would call in and say all kind of egregious things that just had they didn't even have the basic facts right. So we were able to, sift through those, but this one made me sit up in my seat. It was partly in the way that she spoke, some other things she said in the conversation, basically the voicemail that she left me, and the fact that she had these little details made me just really curious, and I kept playing it. And so I told my producer, I'm like, this is just, I don't know, there's something about this. We've got to find her. And she did leave, at that time, pagers were popular. So she left a pager number. I was able to page her back, and eventually she called me back. And so when I started to talk to her even more, she was sharing more, but of course not her father's name, her name, any of that. And so, but just the things she was sharing about growing up and being in the car and raining and all these different memories, it just really made me think this is something that I really need to follow up on. And so, whereas we were having all this criticism for doing the story, now all of a sudden we're on the inside of something else potentially, but of course we could not report it because we could not confirm it. So that was the hardest part, was being, working behind the scenes and trying to figure out what was going on. But we quickly learned that investigators were very interested in what we had. And the only reason they found out is because I had called Carol's stepfather, Paul Davis, to ask about this yellow scarf. And he then called them and asked. And so there was this big, uproar. And then I was shut out completely. Police weren't talking to me, anyone. So, and he said they were really very concerned that I had this information and didn't want him to talk to me anymore either. And so that kind of, when you get that kind of reaction, if it was nothing, then they'd be like, that's, whatever. But they were really like doubling down at that point. And so we just kept pulling on that thread and kept pulling. And eventually we were able to, I was able to meet with Shirley. I was able to see some of her documentation, things that, therapy sessions she had gone into. just a lot of the pieces started to come together. And so we were in a race, though, with the state police. Clearly there was no love lost between us and our investigation. So it was a race. We were racing to find this man, and they were racing to find him. And unbeknownst to me, Shirley's sister-in-law had decided, she had saw my broadcast, and she decided that she was frustrated that Shirley hadn't gone to the police yet. So she wrote an anonymous letter to the state police and told the names and everything. So they had a little bit more than me. So they were out in front of me a bit, but it was quite a time uh, to really, be pursuing this story in between doing other stories, which was difficult because I just wanted to focus on this. But of course, when you're working in a newsroom, you have to continue to produce content and investigations. So finally, there was an announcement that an arrest had been made, and it was, in fact, this woman's father, who was 70 years old at the time.
Wow. I love also how, you basically ask people, which, we sometimes forget, like, hey, if you have anything on the case, tell us about it. And that was really good. Let me introduce our second reporter and our second story. In July 1965, police officer Edward Nugent encountered John Wesley Wilder, a black man, outside a cafe in Ruston, Louisiana. Nugent shot Wilder 5 times, resulting in his death. Local authorities deemed it a justifiable homicide, and subsequent investigations in 1965 didn't bring justice or closure to Wilde's family. In 2008, federal legislation did give some hope to families seeking justice for racially motivated homicides prior to 1970. Our guest reporter, Ben Greenberg, uncovered evidence that the shooting was unprovoked, and he tells the story in a podcast episode called A Death Ruled Justifiable. Now, Ben took a very unusual path to investigative reporting. He told me he started off as an English Lit PhD student when he first started looking into unpunished racist murders from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. His dissertation on Gertrude Stein and American poetry never got finished, but Ben's reporting has appeared in national outlets such as NPR and USA Today. He co-founded CIR's, that's the Center for Investigative Reporting's short-lived civil rights cold case project, and more recently led digital production for the PBS history series American Experience, and won an Emmy Award for his reporting Unsolved, Frontline's multi-platform investigation of civil rights cold cases and the federal effort to grapple with them. Ben, going after unsolved and unpunished racist murders from the past, as well as some recent cases, it's really become your main focus as an investigative reporter. Like, why this beat? I mean, it's so hard, and you're an independent reporter also, which, it makes it like feels like triply hard. So talk to us a little bit about like what drew you to this.
Sure. Well, as you alluded to in the bio, I didn't plan to be a journalist. I was aspiring to be a English professor, a poet, but my father had been involved in the civil rights movement and in other progressive organizing, labor movement, uh, uh, anti-nuclear movement in the early 1960s. Um, and while I was working on my dissertation proposal around the time that my father passed away, I started in the late 1990s. I started trying to find out more about his past because I'm born in 1969, and all these activities really predated my existence. And he did not share a lot about them when he was alive, and I was around. So I kind of first just actually started researching other pieces of his life, and I was a grad student. I knew how to do research, and I'm digging into things about friends and relationships. He'd been close to jazz musicians. He had a story very similar to Nat Hentoff's in the book Boston Boy, hanging around jazz clubs in Boston and befriending older musicians. He ran away from home in Brighton, Massachusetts, to New York City, and ended up living with a black jazz musician named Frankie Newton. And I started just trying to learn more about Frankie Newton and his recordings, and I started developing a deeper interest, wider interest in his whole past, and started doing Freedom of Information Act requests about his involvement in the civil rights movement. And I started asking around amongst the community of civil rights movement veterans who knew him, what they knew about things that he did, and that hooked me into that community a bit. And I started hearing in the early 2000s conversation about these unpunished racist murders and other racist violence that was so much the norm at the time. And in 2005, there was a big case. A former Klansman named Edgar Ray Killen was indicted for his role in the murders of the three civil rights workers, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And I was hearing the chatter in the community about this case, because at the time that Killen was indicted, there were about 10 other suspects in the case. All these people are known because of federal court documents and reporting, and there are all these other figures in the case who were suspects, who are known to have been allegedly involved, and they were only going after this one guy. And I had been blogging about my research about my dad while I was supposedly doing my dissertation proposal, and that so it was originally just kind of like an online diary of my research. I didn't really know what I was doing with it. I was home with a new baby, my eldest child, and I thought that I would be writing my dissertation with my baby strapped on my chest. And the more I was writing and learning about my dad, I also, and connected to the civil rights community, I was developing really sort of an interest in the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, and beginning to blog about current events through the lens of sort of my looking into history. And these killings were very interesting to me, and I was blogging about the Neshoba murders case, the Edgar Ray Killen prosecution, and starting to get attention for it. People in Mississippi were looking at the things I was writing. The mainstream news coverage was really looking at these other suspects, or the kind of the complexities around how the community had come together to prosecute Edgar Ray Killen, and all the kind of the problems with some of that. Before I knew it, I'd been invited to Mississippi to attend the annual memorial that is held by the family that was James Cheney and Michael Schwerner's point of contact in Neshoba County to set up a freedom school there. Really the precursor to the murders. And so in 2005, at the same year that Killen was going on trial, I was going to Mississippi, and I was really excited. I was not really yet seeing myself as a journalist exactly. But I was really excited to be connecting with my father's legacy, and to be really had this sort of way of accessing this world that had seemed so foreign and distant. I called my mom to tell her excitedly, and she was happy that I was researching my father's past. And I was like, "Mom, I'm going to Mississippi. I'm going to this memorial." And I stopped, and the phone line just got really quiet. And then I heard a tone of voice that I'd never heard in my life from my mother, and she just said, "You're not going." And in that moment, I kind of perceived that all of the kind of stress and anxiety that she had felt about my dad going to Alabama as an employee of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and an assistant to Dr. King, that she she was traumatized, and that she couldn't handle the idea of my kind of entering that world that my dad had risked his life in, probably numerous times. So I started going to these memorials, and on another trip I decided I would just do some research about some case that I was looking into, just out of interest, there was another case that was being prosecuted in 2007, the double murders of Henry D. and Charles Moore in Southwest Mississippi, and I ended up going to the memorial in Neshoba County on the eastern side of the state, but then traveling to the other side of the state to just do some research because I had some questions. And I wasn't really yet doing this as a reporter, and I found myself in Woodville, Mississippi, a tiny town in the corner of Southwest Mississippi near the Louisiana border, talking to an NAACP official. And after I was all done talking to him about the questions that I had, another Black woman from the town came up to me and just asked me if I was a reporter. And I said, well, no, I'm just, I'm a writer. I'm doing some research. And she and her husband took me into their store and spent like a couple of hours telling me about every horrible thing that had happened in their town that they knew about for the last 50, 60 years. They mentioned a number of murders, including the murder of a man named Clifton Walker from that town in 1964. And I went the next day to the archives at the University of Southern Mississippi, where I was just pursuing this kind of research without a complete clear objective. And I'm going through the papers of the former governor, Paul Johnson, at the university, and there are all these highway patrol reports, Mississippi Highway Patrol reports, and there are these pages of state police reports on the murder of Clifton Walker that I'd just been hearing about the day before, whose name I never heard before in my life. And they were riveting. You couldn't make this stuff up. And descriptions of the crime scene, descriptions of kind of allegations of interracial dating, and kind of as a potential motive for the killing. And the woman had told me that Mrs. Smith had told me that that the children of the victim were alive, that his widow had been deceased for some years, and that one of them lived in New Orleans. And I spent about a year after that trying to track her down. Her name is Catherine Walker Jones, and I got her on the phone. I just cold called her, and I explained nervously why I was calling and what I was doing. At that point, I had published some journalism on Hurricane Katrina, and on another of the cases that I learned about that day in Woodville, Mississippi. And
No, I was just gonna, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for you to talk.
sorry.
That's okay, because I think your journey to this work is, is really important, because I think it shows like it's available there. People are talking about it. People are living it with it. And I actually want to ask both of you, a question, because so much of this is asking people 50, 60, years and years later, right, for their memories, right? And Ben, I want to play a clip because, you ended up finding witnesses that no one ever interviewed. And Sandra, you were talking to people who had never, told their story, but it was years later. And it's hard. It's sometimes hard, older people, I'm older myself, their memories. But I want to play this one clip of a guy named Bill Smith, who lived in Ruston the whole time. He was 16 years old the night of the shooting, right? He watched the whole thing go down. And he was never interviewed. And then 70 years later, this is how he described it to you. So again, bear with me. I'm just gonna find the clip. And yeah, just go one. Oops, sorry.
And the first police car came from east on Vaughn, parked right up in front of the church.
The southern end of Jones Street comes to a T at West Vaughn Avenue. The historic New Hope Baptist Church, which is over 150 years old, sits on the south side of Vaughn, overlooking Jones Street.
The next one came from Vaughn and parked right in front of the church. The third one came down Jones and stopped right in front of the barber shop. When I know anything, they got guns drawn, and Wes Wilder is coming out of that door of the building across the street. And he staggers as he comes toward the street, and staggered just like a drunk man, like he was, you know. And this officer was the one I saw shoot. Wes ended up leaning on the pole that's in the ground over there. The officer that came down Jones Street, he parked right in front of the place. And I was almost in direct line of him and shooting across the street. And after Wes leaned on the pole and fell, I took off around this corner and ran home to tell my mama that the police had shot Wes Wilder. I never did find out what happened in the cafe that would cause the police to come. I ain't never heard nobody tell me that.
So, this is really a question for both of you. I mean, just talk a little bit about how, getting people to open up who haven't talked and told their stories before, maybe haven't asked, but also how do you validate, how do you verify, what they're telling you? Sandra, you talked a little bit about your source was able to share, documents. Ben, how about you? I mean, how did you go about validating the details of what this witness was telling you?
Well, with Bill Smith, at the point that I spoke with him, I already had these 6 affidavits that I dug out of an archive that were given by Black witnesses to the killing, whose affidavits had not been found or looked at by the FBI when they reopened the case between 2008 and 2011. And so I had these half a dozen accounts that were quite consistent with each other. So I already felt pretty strongly that there were multiple witness accounts that told a pretty consistent version of the story that was drastically different from the received version of the story by the police. Bill's account tracked those accounts very closely. There was really just one main difference, which is that in those accounts, Officer Nugent rolls up on the scene, and there's a kind of exchange between him and Wilder and Wilder's cousin, and then with the crowd that kind of forms as the altercation ensues. And Bill Smith, as you heard him describe, 3 cars coming up, rolling up on the street from different directions, and basically setting up and shooting once Wilder came out. So that was a difference, and I haven't been able to kind of figure out how to verify that, that versus the other versions. But there was enough that was consistent about the stories that I felt strongly that he was a credible witness. So really, I made sure that I tried to just be transparent about those kinds of things. I both pieces are in the reporting, so that I'm not, alleging that one thing or the other is what's definitively true. But it had these other documents to check his testimony against.
For sure. And just to the audience, if you have any questions about fact checking or, how you verify, eyewitness testimony that really contradicts kind of the official record, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A. Sandra,
okay.
Go ahead, Ben. Was there something?
I was just going to say, well, the other thing is just in terms of credibility, and Sandra, you spoke to this too a little bit about things that a subject says that give it qualitatively the feeling of it being credible. First time I reached Bill Smith, I didn't know that he was a potential witness, and I asked him questions. I was explaining what I was calling. He said, and then before I got a few words out, he said, "I was there," and I told him what I had learned so far. And he said, "That's not how it went down." And he got in his car while he had me on his cell phone, drove to the scene and started talking me through what he saw as if you were reliving it. And at that point, again, like, I needed to verify, but that spoke to him really having a very personal experience of this murder.
And I just want to jump in on that. We talked to lots of people. We talked to the family of the alleged suspects, those that were cleared. Everyone knew something. There was a lot of information. And so talking, especially in this case where some of the records were missing, things were, the police investigation was just very sloppy. So we had a lot of human sources. Not everybody went on camera, but a lot of people spoke about various things that had happened. And even family members of some of these suspects spoke and confirmed, yes, they were a suspect. Here's what happened. Talked to such and such. And even with Shirley, she told me about her sister-in-law, Connie, eventually. And that, how, their relationship, why she told Connie, she trusted her. And she was the one when state police confronted Shirley and said, we're looking at your father. And they said, who did you tell about this case? And she said, the only person I told, other than talking to Sandra Chapman, was Connie McQueen. So, and I spoke with Connie. So, when you can go around and talk to a number of people, the story comes together and you can, and then of course, records, FOIAs from the FBI, from various agencies, you put all of that together and your story then begins to take shape as to what things you can actually say and corroborate.
Sure, sure. Just a reminder, please feel free to put, questions into the Q&A. And Sandra, there's a question for you actually, on this topic. I'm curious to know more about how you built up your relationship with the father such that he trusted you to do this investigation and make the documentary, and how important this connection was to the success of your story.
It was tremendously important. Mr. Davis, he had talked to a number of reporters. I was new. And I think maybe perhaps the fact that I wanted to know the whole story. I wanted to know what happened, from the beginning. I wanted to hear what he had to say. And so I spent time with him. I spent a couple of hours listening to him. He had lots of, newspaper articles, everything that I could review and look at and understand, why he was telling me what he was. And so again, I go back to source building. It's so important in some of these cases because records aren't always, back in the 60s, they didn't keep records like they do now. One of the investigators involved basically took the entire files home with him. And when he died, no one knows what happened to all the other case files except for the things that were still there, like the initial police report and those sort of things. So, and then with Shirley, building that rapport with her was incredibly important. She was a victim in many respects of this as well. And I took a class at Sundance when I decided to do the documentary because I wanted to understand that side of it, the film side. And one of the important things they talk about is not re-traumatizing the victims or the people that are going to be sources for you. And so that was very important that I hear Shirley, that we agreed on what we would talk about. There's so much more to her story that probably would have made, the story more salacious, but it wasn't germane to the investigation, so we didn't include it because our point was not to drag so much of her story onto the screen that it would, harm or injure her, but it was to provide the necessary information to basically support the narrative of what had happened and what she could tell us about this killing. And so the source development is extremely important. And then, it is a lot of work. It's a lot of talking to people and talking to people different times, and then comparing those stories and the information they give you. And sometimes they, remember different things. And I say, people are traumatized by events like this. They're going to remember something that was so dramatic. And for Shirley, as a 7-year-old little girl, she remembered the flashes of yellow. She remembered the rain. She remembered Carol falling. Those are the things that stayed in her mind and actually traumatized her. And so, when they talk about those things and letting them talk about that, it gives you a sense of what they were feeling and going through, kind of like what Ben was saying a little bit earlier, when you're talking to witnesses like that.
Yeah. A couple more questions for both of you. One, in an active cold case where law enforcement claims the investigation is ongoing and most of the case files are not available to the public, are there any documents, legal or otherwise, that could be available? I don't know if this gets into the Emmett Till Unresolved Civil Rights Crime Act, which I know both of you have interacted with in terms of your cases, but could you talk a little bit about that, where there's an active case where there might be documents, or are documents hidden?
Well, I'll jump in real quick. Just in our case, the suspect who was arrested died 3 months after he was arrested. And so there was so much more about him that Shirley had told me, and I was curious. I wanted to verify things. So he was a veteran, and she told me about the story where he had this major blow up on a train to basic training as an enlistee. And so I foiled for information um, from his military service unit, and I got a trove of information back that was public information about his mental health, what happened, this incident that happened. Again, things corroborating Shirley's story again, but also when someone is deceased, you can actually, if they're involved in a case, you can actually send a request to the FBI or other federal agencies. And I did that, and I got information back about Kenneth Clay Richmond, and it was able to corroborate again that he had been a suspect in this death, in the killing of Carol Jenkins. And so there are ways that you can still get information. The National Archives, a great place, because organizations like the NAACP sometimes they turn over their records so that there will be a record there about things in their communities. And one of those things for our case was that there had been this request to bring the DOJ into this case because the leaders of the NAACP here had deemed that this was a racial motivated killing. And so there is a record of that. So you might be able to pull in other records from federal agencies asking for different things, but sometimes that helps bring, just more insight into what was happening at the time.
Yeah.
I can just add that in my experience with cold cases, if there were FBI federal documents generated when the case was first investigated decades ago, those documents tend to be available via FOIA, even if the case has been reopened and it's an active investigation. So, I mean, when I got all the documents that I did on the murder of Clifton Walker from 1964, that case was open under the Till Act. But I could get the older documents where I, what's more challenging, where I ran into challenges was at the state level. When I made requests for various documents that from like the crime scene and so forth that seemed to exist based on reports from the state, I got the line that this is an ongoing investigation and we can't give you anything basically. I can't emphasize enough the importance of investigation that was done by civil rights organizations, as Sandra was just talking about. For Mississippi cases, in my experience, Medgar Evers was, it's not how people talk about him as much, but he was an indefatigable investigator. That many Mississippi killings that occurred during his tenure at the NAACP, he investigated as a field officer for the NAACP. And so the NAACP papers at the National Archives have all these, investigative reports. And there's another case the one that I did with Frontline about Roman Ducksworth Jr., where his reporting for the NAACP was one of the main ways that I was able to kind of investigate and look at what else may have happened besides what was in, kind of the federal records and another news reporting about the case.
Ben, just a quick clarification. Someone's asking, who did you FOIA?
Oh, I FOIA'd Clifton Walker. I FOIA'd his name.
Got it. Got it. One other question, as an independent reporter, and really both of you, Sandra, you did your documentary independently, Ben, you've been independent, especially during these contentious times. Did you have any concerns about liability, legal challenges? I don't know, what's the fear factor, I guess, for you working in this area?
Well, for me, I mean, I had experienced most of that while I was actually working for a station. The state police had actually tried to drag me into the case. They had tried to get my reporting records. We fought it. I didn't have to, of course, turn over any of my news gathering, but they wanted what I had. They were afraid that I had as much as they did. And so, there was it was very contentious. And so I think after going through that, I understood, number one, who I was working with or working around, I should say, because they weren't helping me whatsoever. But, I do think it's wise to, have some legal help, if there are things that you're looking at that you want to make sure that again, you're going to practice good journalism and make sure that you have your sources buttoned up. But it's also a good idea to just make sure that if you have any concerns about safety or anything like that, that you are, you know, creating some sort of a network to make sure that people know where you are, who you're talking to, and that sort of thing. And I know there are organizations out there that can help you with that. One of those is the International Women's Media Foundation. They were one of my sponsors as well for this, but they actually, provide ways to be able to operate safely and give you a lot of tips on doing that. So it is important.
Yeah. Question for both of you, and folks, if you can stay on, there's so many questions, I want to try and get to them. So if Ben and Sandra, if you're willing to stay a couple extra minutes.
Sure.
How do you feel about teaming up with another reporter in terms of sources, being, Ben, in your case, maybe teaming up with someone locally who might know the sources in the community. Have you ever done that before? Or working with people locally who might know about cases. Sandra, obviously, you are a local, so that it might be a little bit different, but or teaming up with someone to make sure that whether it's to cross race lines, to Sandra, you were dealing with a situation where there was this white community that was so resistant to kind of confronting its past. So just talk a little bit about whether or not you did team up with people. Have you thought about teaming up with people? And what your recommendations would be.
So, I mean, I've definitely had challenges as a white person showing up in Black contexts, because, I'm a white Northerner entering into Black Southern spaces, and it's understandable that I might not be trusted. And so I think there are a variety of things that I do and have done. Some are, simply managing my own expectations, not assuming that I have a right to these stories or that people are going to trust me just because I earnestly want to find out about the stories. I also generally, when I look at stories and investigate them, I'm looking to see if there are family members who are invested in finding out more or finding injustice for their loved ones. And I try to involve the family as much as possible, and in in some cases, I've like actually had family members come with me on investigative trips, where I'm going to interview subjects, and the family member joins me, that changes the whole experience of an interview dramatically in a variety of ways, both in terms of people's in terms of trust in me, but also the moral weight of that family member being there can really impact the dynamics of the interview. And I, also tend, in this John Wesley Wilder case, Bill Smith and other elder Black people in the community really wanted me to succeed, and were, there's people who are fearful and kind of didn't want to talk to me, and then there are people like Bill Smith and others in the community who are fearless, and who and who right away had a sense of kind of what it was I was trying to do, and really would put me in contact with people and kind of convey that that I could be trusted. And I don't lead with my background, my family background in the civil rights movement, but when it comes up, it definitely helps to inspire trust when people hear that my father worked for Dr. King, and I have this connection to the civil rights movement. That means something when I, in many cases, and can help gain trust.
Yeah. And I would say real quickly that in this particular case, I don't think my race made a difference necessarily in Martinsville. They just didn't want to talk about the case, period, because there were people in town who were very welcoming. And two of the main characters, witnesses, and who had met Carol that night were a couple by the name of Don and Norma Neal. And they were adamant, and they spoke out, and they wanted to talk about this case. They remembered it. They suffered trauma because Norma Neal put Carol in a car driving around trying to help her find the group of encyclopedia salespeople that she was with. So it really, I think, comes down to sometimes, it probably couldn't hurt if you did that, but in many cases, you might not have that option to be able, or that luxury to be able to do it. So a lot of times I like to just build rapport. And so I'll do a pre-interview on the phone and just talk to them and let them know, I'm just wanting to know, I want to understand what you saw, what happened. And so we're building a rapport, and then ask, is there another family member? Is there somebody else that might be able to add to this story who you think would be willing to take a phone call? And so I did a lot of that. And after those phone calls, then okay, we're ready to sit down and do an interview on camera. Now, many of them, said no, not because I was Black or they didn't want to, that sort of thing, but they were afraid of the retribution from their community. And, in the documentary, Norma Neal talks about that. They had a consequence for being outspoken about this case. And so I think that was more of an issue for us, is that people were legitimately afraid of speaking out and what would happen. All of the people who did had some sort of consequence. They lost relationships, basically, with loved ones, with families, being split about whether they should talk about their family secrets or not. So those are the types of issues that we really had to work to overcome the most.
Well, you just answered a really important question from someone, both in terms of, people, given the tension around anything related to conversations around race, how it might affect the journalists, but also how it might affect attendees. I have about 100 more questions. I will say for anyone, one of the things that I found remarkable in both your stories is just when you thought like the story was over, what you did was you brought it forward to today. And you really made it clear why investigating these cases matters today. Why finding out the truth while holding accountability, even if the person has died, how important it still is. And I really just want to congratulate both of you on fantastic work. I want to encourage anybody to please listen to the podcast, watch the documentary, look at the tip sheet. The tip sheet is really filled with like very, very practical tips about this information is out there. These cases probably happened in your community. Your community probably has still a lot of unresolved issues. And it is a way to have these difficult conversations in some way to sort of, bring it forward. So thank you, Sandra and Ben, so much for doing this kind of reporting. Again, the tip sheet will be on the FIJ site. Anybody who's signed up for the webinar today will get a recording. Regular grants, again, $10,000. The deadline's Monday, September 8th. Seed grants, that's for $2,500. That's the preliminary reporting. The deadline is September 15th. If you have questions about any of this, you can go to the website. You can also email us at grants@fij.org. There's lots of resources. We're so grateful you were able to spend time with us today. Sandra, Ben, thank you for your work. Thank you so much for your work. And everyone else, y'all have a great weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.